Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's program is a continuation of the Stroll Back in Time series, which takes us on a journey through downtown Bayfield, a journey back in time where we can see and learn about buildings and the characters that inhabited them and the way of life back in the day. To share this with us is Dan Wilczek. Dan has been with the BHA Board of Directors since 2018, and he moved to Bayfield after practicing law in the Twin Cities for his career. Dan is an excellent storyteller and an avid researcher, historian. I would say that's his new career and calling. So you are in for a treat. And also finally want to thank our program sponsor. The Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy provides grant support so that we can host these programs free of charge. We also thank our many donors out there who help support our free museum, our educational programs, and our archival research center. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dan.
Good evening, and thanks for joining me on this fourth and final segment of our stroll down Rittenhouse. At the conclusion of our stroll, I will be talking a bit about the life of Jim Erickson, who in many ways personified the history of Bayfield. Before we begin our stroll, I want to recognize the resources I used to prepare this program. I continue to be amazed at the resources available at BHA, and am grateful to those who worked hard to preserve Bayfield's history, particularly the people who work in our Pike Research Center, and to Bob Nelson, whose knowledge is both broad and deep, and who's always gracious in answering questions. For this talk, I also took advantage of the work of John Hansen, who has videotaped interviews with a large number of people to preserve their firsthand knowledge of Bayfield's past. These interviews are now in the process of being posted on BHA's YouTube channel. I encourage you to take a look at them because they are very interesting. But I have a lot to share, so let's get started. We'll begin our stroll where the last one ended. So there we are, stroll 1, stroll 2. Last time we covered a grand total of 1 building, and today we will cover the remainder of the block. Along the way, I will talk about Bayfield Civic League, which made significant contributions to life in Bayfield in the past, and which continues that tradition today. We'll start with a few panoramic views of the section of Bayfield that will be the subject of our program. Here's a photo from sometime early in the 20th century, before the city dock and before the Pavilion, when the land where we now find Memorial Park was a site of a large hall. Here's another photo, which now includes some additional structures that we'll cover: the gazebo and the pavilion. And finally, here's an aerial photograph from 1963, which provides hopefully some further orientation to the area that we'll be discussing today. You'll note that this area has continued to evolve in the last 50 years. The Bayfield Inn and the Pier restaurant are not found in this photo. So let's get started. So we're going to begin with the area on the south side of Rittenhouse between First and Front Street, the area now occupied by Memorial Park and the Bayfield Inn. The 1886 bird's eye map will serve as our entry point into the history of this area. Here is a section of the bird's eye map to help orient you to the area we are discussing. This is Howell right here. This is where the Bayfield Inn is now located, and this is Memorial Park. In 1883, the saloon, marked by the blue arrow, was a saloon owned by Mr. Batan, who, according to the publication Industries of Bayfield, made a specialty of keeping only the better quality of liquors and cigars, and in his stock may be found mellow old brandies, sparkling wines, and cigars of the best brand. Mr. Batan also had a billiard room and a public hall upstairs. The large building behind the saloon was Bayfield's first roller skating rink. The rink was built in 1885. It was 2 stories high, with galleries overlooking the rink. In 1887, it was converted into a combination roller rink and theater with, as it was described, a commodious stage and scenery. You also see there with the green arrow the location of Bayfield's first police office. By 1892, the roller skating rink had been converted into a warehouse, and the second story of the saloon no longer included a billiard room. Rather, it was now noted to include a hall and a stage. That public hall became Bayfield's first opera house. Here's a picture of the opera house, and the opera house dined there on the second story of the building. And in front of the building is what I suspect is a local band posing for a picture in front of the building where it performed. Here's another picture of the band. This one, the drummer was good enough to turn the face of the drum toward the photograph, so we know that that one was from 1890. And here's yet another picture of the opera house. Now, construction of opera houses in small cities was quite popular in the second half of the 19th century. They were not always grand. Sometimes the opera house was a freestanding building. Other times, like here, it was a hall in the second story of the building. The name opera house was not intended to depict the primary function of the space. Indeed, an opera was likely never performed in many of these opera halls. These opera houses were more of an all-purpose community hall used for a variety of functions. The name opera house was intended to lend the town an aura of sophistication. The history of opera houses in the Midwest states that towns could not call themselves sophisticated without an opera house. And I guess that was the origin of the saying, "You're not a sophisticated town until the fat lady sings." By 1898, the saloon and public hall was remodeled into a hotel. A hotel has been located on that parcel of land for over 120 years with different names and operated by various owners. It was the Didas Hotel, the City Hotel, the Brackett Hotel as shown in this drawing. Subsequently, it was used as an annex to the Bracken Hotel when the Brackens took over the large hotel, which had been the Davis Hotel, located on the land now occupied by the Grunke's parking lot. Later, it was a location of Hotel Bayfield and now the Bayfield Inn. Bayfield, sophisticated city that it was, could not be left without an opera house when the former opera house was converted to a hotel. So the former warehouse was reborn as an opera house, and it too was put to a variety of uses, including showing movies in 1909. Though I'm not sure, I believe this is a picture of an event held in Bayfield's Opera House. And here's a picture of the Opera House in 1915. You can see it was a very large structure. The Opera House was at times referred to as the Wing Opera House after Colonel Isaac Wing, who's shown in this picture. He had purchased the building. Eleanor Knight states he was one of our best citizens and will always be remembered because Port Wing is named after him. I was not able to find a lot more information about Colonel Wing, but I'm going to go out on a limb and speculate that he was a dog lover. The Opera House later became the Bayfield Armory and evidently fell into disrepair. It was purchased by the Bayfield Civic League in 1920 and was renamed Memorial Hall. Now, the Civic League is the oldest civic organization for women in Bayfield. It was organized in 1913, and its purposes were to cultivate the higher ideas of civic life and to promote sanitation, outdoor art, and the general welfare of the town. Over the years, they have been responsible for a variety of projects for the betterment of Bayfield. For example, in 1916, the league sponsored a Chautauqua. Now, Chautauquas were adult educational and social events and were then really in their heyday. Teddy Roosevelt stated that Chautauquas were the most American thing in America. Now, the league's purchase of the Memorial Hall is particularly noteworthy as it was a significant financial investment. I don't know the purchase price, but I do know the Civic League was bold, as shown by the fact that they took out a loan of $4,000. Now, that's $55,000 in today's money for repairs to the building. And they put that building to good use. It was used for various events, including plays, concerts, movies, dances, basketball games, and Girl Scout parties. Perhaps most noteworthy were the frolics. And this was a multi-day variety show performed by various local residents. It was a huge attraction and the league's most successful fundraiser. Although the league was certainly in favor of fun, it sought to ensure that the hall was not used for disreputable behavior. Eleanor Knight reported that at Memorial Hall dances, placards to the following effect were displayed. Here's a picture of the Civic League members around 1930. As I noted, the Opera Hall, after it was purchased by the Civic League, was renamed Memorial Hall. This is a picture of a young lady in front of Memorial Hall in the fall of 1923. And we can date this picture pretty specifically because that was the time at which the Civic League added a veranda to the Memorial Hall to take advantage of the really nice lake view it had. The veranda is visible behind the Memorial Hall sign. Again, this was not a small investment for the Civic League. The veranda cost about $19,000 in today's money. And here we can take a look at the sandboard maps from 1911 and 1923, and you can see the addition of the veranda on the 1923 sandboard map. Unfortunately, the Civic League did not get a lot of use out of the veranda. January 1924, the Girl Scouts sponsored a dance attended by about 200 guests. The Bayfield Progress reported that practically every couple was engaged in a circle dance when a fire broke out. As you might guess, the fire created considerable fear among the guests who sought to leave the hall quickly. In a situation eerily similar to the sinking of the Titanic, the musicians playing in the hall at the time, the Carlson Orchestra, continued to play in an effort to calm the crowd. The response to the fire was hampered by cold weather. The water main was frozen, so the firefighters were forced to relocate the hoses. And the water line in the hall's kitchen was also frozen. So they only had a couple of buckets and the coffee, which was ready to be served, to initially attempt to douse the flames. But the effort was ultimately futile. The fire quickly grew out of control. The Progress reported that widespread damage to the downtown was likely averted only because the wind was blowing from the west. The hall was completely destroyed. There was hope that the hall would be rebuilt, but that did not occur. And in 1935, the league donated the land to the city for the creation of Memorial Park. And here's a picture of the park in about 1928. Now, when you visit the park today, you can still sit in, or perhaps more accurately, you can still sit on the wing opera house. The retaining wall, shown here by the blue arrow, is a section of the opera house's foundation. The opera house burned down, but the hotel continued and ultimately became Hotel Bayfield. It was a handsome structure. Here's a picture of it earlier. And you can see in this picture how the hotel was significantly enlarged to extend greatly to the south. We have here a picture of the Hotel Bayfield lobby in about 1954. This block has had bad luck with fire. On April 5, 1964, Bayfield Hotel was itself destroyed by fire. The fire started around 1 p.m. The cause was believed to be a spark from the fireplace that ultimately blew on one of its wooden shingles and ignited the building. The hotel was completely destroyed, a loss of almost $80,000. Fortunately, no one was destroyed, though guests lost all belongings that they could not carry with them in a hurry. The hotel also housed some permanent residents, such as Morty Baldwin of Morty's Bar, who lost everything in the fire. It also housed the high school basketball coach and his wife, who had recently been married, and they lost many of their wedding presents in the fire. As we all know, ultimately, Hotel Bayfield was replaced by the Bayfield Inn. And here's a postcard from the inn's early days. And you can't look at this postcard without longing for the return to the days when Orange and yellow were the primary colors on the palette for interior decorating. We'll now turn to the pavilion. The pavilion was built in 1925, in part to capitalize on the anticipated influx of tourism for the Indian pageant. Picture 1935, another subsequent picture. Like the Opera House, the Pavilion has been the host of many different events. Events included professional wrestling. Here's some photos of the wrestlers. 2 out of these 3 photos were wrestlers who actually performed in the Pavilion. The third photo is a photo of the former governor of Minnesota. If you can't tell which is which, I'll give you a little hint. Now, Bayfield couldn't be without a roller rink. And so the Pavilion also housed a roller rink. Here's a picture from 1975 of some youngsters having a good time in a roller rink. And also a picture of some folks who worked there making sure the roller skates were ready to roll. The Pavilion did fall into disrepair. It had been purchased by the city in, I believe, 1939 and was renovated in 1997. And as we know now, it is used for many purposes, including as a popular venue for weddings. We'll now turn to another piece of handiwork of the Civic League, the gazebo. The gazebo was built in 1913. The league felt that the town needed a place where folks could sit and wait for boats, have a picnic, or just enjoy the view. It cost $300 to build, and you'll note that it was initially located on the other side of the city dock. This is one example of a momentous event that directly involved the gazebo, the visit by President Coolidge. We'll get to more later. Another picture of the gazebo showing its former location. And here's a picture of the gazebo, again in its former location, with a nice shot of the Bracken Hotel. This shows where the gazebo was ultimately moved to. And I think the members of the league in 1913 who decided to build the gazebo would be very happy to see how much the structure has been central in many of the noteworthy events in Bayfield over the years. Again, the visit of President Coolidge. Here it looks like a gathering of folks coming in from the boat, another celebration. The gazebo was a central part of the 1956 centennial celebration for Bayfield. Here's a church service with the choir. Here's the band playing in front of the gazebo. Here's, well, my goodness, here's Abe Lincoln at the gazebo, along with some other folks. This was a central spot for the Boy Scout Stockton Island Camporee in 1959. So the gazebo has been a really important part of the city over the years as a result of the foresight, really, of the Civic League. This is a picture of a local project. I believe those are high school kids making some repairs to the gazebo. Now we'll turn to the area now located by the pier. We see here the 1886 Sanborn map. We have 2 maps here. First is the building that is located precisely where the pier is now located. And we'll also be talking about the building slightly up the road to the north, which was a saloon and boarding house. Here's a really nice picture showing the 2 buildings. The blue building is the Roberts House, I believe, and then the red building we can see is the New Brunswick Hotel. In 1883, the building denoted by the blue arrow was, as I said, the Roberts House, run by William Roberts from the industries of Bayfield, whose ability to cater to the wants of his guests is well known. The dining room seated 24 with an elegantly fitted bar and billiard room. Later, the Roberts House was expanded and became the Harbor City Hotel. And you'll notice that the Harbor City Hotel also incorporated the moving picture show that we talked about during Stroll 3. By 1923, however, both the Roberts House and the New Brunswick Hotel were gone. What happened? Well, I suspect that the arrival of the railroad decreased the demand for hotel rooms along the lakefront and increased it near the railroad depot. In fact, sometime between 1911 and 1923, the building that was the New Brunswick Hotel was moved on logs from its location there on Front Street to its current location on Manypenny, where it was initially operated as the Maple Leaf Hotel. So when you're going to pick up your mail and you go by this building, know that that building on the corner is one of the oldest buildings in Bayfield. The Harbor City Hotel ultimately left, and that space was taken by an A&W restaurant in the 1950s. Here's also a picture which shows the A&W root beer restaurant there in the orange bracket. And here's a picture of the predecessor to the current pier, which was obviously a very different building than what we have now. Now, before ending the stroll, I do want to talk a bit about other things that were going on in this area to try to give some sense of what it was like during the early 1900s. From 1898 to 1922, the Transfer Railroad was in operation. This area that we're talking about was an area of some real hustle and bustle and economic activity at the turn of the century. And when we talk about that hustle and bustle, we need to talk about the Transfer Railroad. Its tracks ran east along Front Street and over the lake on a series of trestles, which are a remarkable feat of engineering. So here we see the Transfer Railroad almost directly in front of Memorial Hall, and this long trestle that was constructed for the railroad. And then the railroad continued there north along the lake shore. This drawing represents this area in around 1911. I found it interesting that the tracks for the railroad ran directly in front of the gazebo. Now, here's a couple pictures that, frankly, I just love these pictures because they really provide a sense of how industrial Bayfield was at one time. At the bottom of the picture here, you can see the Transfer Railroad, the smoke going from the engine there. And it's right next to the Booth Fisheries, which was obviously a real center of economic activity in the town. To the south of this area was the lumber yard. And here's a picture of the lumber yard. Look at all of the structure that was involved in the lumber yard. In the foreground, we have a tram. This is a tram that was used to transport material to ships. We have here the depot for the railroad running down here. Here we have the power plant for Bayfield, which is now City Hall. And here we have the Transfer Railroad. We have a ship out in the distance. To me, this really evokes the economic vitality of Bayfield at this time. Around 1910, they also built the city dock. So there was another area of activity that was added to this portion of town. It became the dock used by the boats coming in, bringing passengers to town. Actually, all the shipping that weren't either destined for the lumber yards or the fisheries. Here's a picture of the area in 1910. So I suggest that the next time you sit in Memorial Park, maybe take a minute and close your eyes and imagine the activity and sound that would have enveloped this area in 1910. This really was a very active area of town. It was not the pleasant, peaceful, and almost sleepy area that it sometimes is now. Well, that concludes my stroll, and I now want to turn to the life of Jim Erickson. On October 4, 2020, Bayfield lost one of its leading citizens, James Erickson. In a life spanning 90 years, Jim was inextricably woven into the fabric of Bayfield. He was a part of Bayfield, and Bayfield was a part of him. In many ways, you can tell the history of Bayfield by reviewing Jim's life. What are the hallmarks of Bayfield's history? Commercial fishing, logging, fruit growing, tourism, Apple Fest. Jim's fingerprints can be found on all those activities. What are the characteristics of a lifelong Bayfielder? Well, I'd argue it's hard work, resiliency, and the courage to adapt when the world around you changes. Jim was all those things. We are blessed to have a living record of Jim's life, told by Jim himself. Filmmaker John Hansen videotaped 2 hours of interviews of Jim in 2004 after conducting an additional 2 hours of interviews with Jim and his wife, Muriel, in 2001. Those interviews, Jim's own words, are the backbone of my comments about Jim today. Now, it's important to note that Jim's connection to Bayfield began long before Jim was born. Jim tells us that his grandfather, Martin, arrived in Ashland with 50 cents in his pocket. Martin was a Bayfield logger, fisherman, and farmer. Jim's grandmother, Christina, worked at a boarding house at Roy's Point. Jim's parents, Ed and Nellie, were also active members of the Bayfield community. In fact, Ed was one time the mayor of Bayfield. Now, Jim was born in 1930 and lived his entire life in Bayfield. Jim worked hard and he was proud of it. He encountered hurdles, but never let those hurdles become roadblocks. As he put it, quote, "That was part of being an Erickson, never giving up. There were hard times and good times, but it all worked out pretty well for them in the end." At a young age, Jim was helping his grandfather with commercial fishing and farming. Jim delivered beans to the Bayfield cannery. At age 13, Jim transported German prisoners of war to various farms to do the farm work that needed to be done because Bayfield's men were off fighting for our freedom in World War II. Jim got his commercial fishing license when he was 18, then the youngest person to ever have a commercial fishing license on the Great Lake. Jim loved commercial fishing, and he had success. But with the lamprey and fishing restrictions, he also had lean years, which he said he was only able to weather because his wife Muriel had a steady income as a teacher. But regardless of the challenges, Jim loved to fish. Jim said that one of the hardest things of his life was when he gave up his commercial fishing license in 1996. But Jim had other cards to play because he never had only one job. He was never just a commercial fisherman. He worked at DuPont hauling dynamite. He did some logging. He farmed. And he ran a charter boat, Muriel Ann, pictured in this postcard. Jim bought the farm where Erickson Country Store is now located in 1956, adding it to the acreage that had been owned by his father. As a farmer, Jim literally put Bayfield on the map as the founder of Apple Fest. Apple Fest was born from a flat tire. Jim was transporting a load of apples to South Dakota when a flat tire left him stranded in Duluth. While he was waiting in Duluth for a new tire to be delivered, he encountered folks who refused to believe that his apples were grown in Bayfield, Wisconsin. But Jim made productive use of his delay in Duluth. While waiting, he sold 27 bushels of apples, and he resolved that he was going to do something to let people know about the Bayfield fruit industry. When he got back to town, he got together with Julian Nelson in the back of Julian's clothing store and developed the concept for Apple Fest, which began in 1962 and continues as the Bayfield event more than 50 years later. And here's Jim and Julian riding in a car during an Apple Fest with a placard on the car, aptly noting that they were the founders of Apple Fest. It was a point of pride for Jim that the Erickson Orchard has always had a float in the Apple Fest parade. Here's one float. I love that car. And here's another float. Jim was very proud of the Erickson Orchard floats. Jim loved Bayfield. He was proud of the role that his family played, and he hoped would continue to play in Bayfield history. But Jim says it all best, and I can think of no better way to end this program than letting Jim speak for himself.
Well, I'm almost out of this tape, Jimmy.
Okay.
So one last word on this subject can you give me?
Well, I was born and raised here. I love the area. Guess I'm gonna die here.
Yeah.
The lake and I've always liked the farming and the both.
This is your home.
This is my home. And I'm very happy, like we discussed before, my kids are back here, and hopefully someday this farm will be theirs.
Let's hope so. And keep it on, another
That's right.
generation. Well, thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's always fun to be transported back in time, and I love that imagery of the smokestacks and the industrious Bayfield lakefront with the railroad and the various industries. And then closing with that video from Jim Erickson, just speaking to the culture, the grit, the courage of Bayfielders. So thank you for the time that you put into researching this and for presenting it with humor and doing a really excellent job. Thank you for joining us. Please visit our website, bayfieldheritage.org, where we will have links to this past program and others, along with those Bayfield Video Archive interviews and many other resources to come.